So yeah, more recently, my interests have shifted from argument mapping to this whole topic of collective wisdom. When I was at Indiana University, there was a fellow there, John Barwise. John Barwise was quite a legend. He started many different areas of philosophy that. Like situation semantics, for example, was a Barwise invention. And he said at one point, every 5 years you should either change your physical location or you should change your field of interest. And this is so that, of course, you don't get stale, so that you can put yourself in a situation where you can actually intellectually reinvigorate and actually start having creative ideas again. And after working in argument mapping for about 10 years or more, it was time to actually start moving on and take on some new challenges. So, as an applied epistemologist, I'm interested in how do we know what we know? Well, how do individuals know what we know? That's one question. How do individuals know what they know? Is one question. How do groups know what groups know? How do we know what we collectively know is another question. One of my favourite examples is the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. How do they determine what it is that they collectively, they being climate science, collectively knows about climate science? Well, they have a very elaborate process for figuring that out. It's well codified. It's 12 major phases in this very, very complex process involving hundreds of different scientists, and it takes quite a bit of time. It's very resource intensive, but out the other end, you come out with a report which represents the collective wisdom of the climate science community. I'm not saying it's perfect, but nevertheless, it's much more than would be had if you didn't have that process to go through. And so groups, collectives can know things. They can be wise, but accessing that knowledge or accessing that wisdom always takes some kind of process. And those processes can be better processes or worse processes. And so as applied epistemologist, I'm interested in how can we redesign some of the existing processes? And I'm in particular interested in how do we collectively, large-scale collective intelligence, on the scale, for example, of Australia, how do we know what we think collectively about some of the most important issues that confront us? How rapidly should we change our energy system, for example, in response to climate change? This is a question I'm really very interested in, and there's an enormous amount of debate out there, but how can you synthesize all that thinking into a coherent collective view that embodies the wisdom of us collectively? We don't have an IPCC process for Australians in general to synthesize their thoughts. We can take an opinion poll, but that doesn't give us collective wisdom. That just gives us a statistical tabulation of the individual views of 1,000 randomly selected individuals, which we extrapolate to the population as a whole. And those 1,000 individuals haven't been very well informed generally. They haven't thought about it very much. They don't have what you might call wise opinions on the matter. It doesn't do us much good to just statistically tabulate that sort of stuff if what we're after is the collective wisdom of Australians in general. We need some other process. What would that process be like? I've drawn inspiration from the deliberative democracy movement, who say, well, you need to get people together, you need to give them a chance to be better informed, you need to get them deliberating collectively, debating with each other, and through that process, you can come up with something that is a much better approximation to collective wisdom. If that group is representative of the population at large, then you can extrapolate that. Say, well, the wisdom of this group on this topic is what will take to be the wisdom of the larger population. I think there's a lot to be said for that, but the problem is that those kinds of processes are slow and expensive and cumbersome, and they almost never happen. So what we need is a mechanism for generating collective wisdom of Australians in general that isn't slow and expensive. It's fast, it's cheap, it's real time, it's large scale, it's completely open, and it's unbiased by government interest, corporate interest, political interest, religious interest. That to me sounds like it would have to be some kind of online forum, a virtual forum. And so what we've been doing with the YourView project is saying, okay, how would you design such a thing? How would you build it? It would have to be engaging, appealing. It would have to get critical mass. It would have to generate something that you could credibly call collective wisdom. So there's a lot of philosophical, epistemological sorts of issues that are in play here, and the goal of this, of course, is to actually make a difference to democratic decision making. Everybody complains about the role of opinion polls, but nobody's got any ideas about how to diminish their role, and there's very few ideas about what would be better than standard opinion polling. Our view basically is that the collective wisdom of Australians in general ought to be part of the political landscape as an alternative to the results of standard opinion polling. But that presupposes you can generate it, you can identify it. Well, there are no mechanisms for that at the moment. Our YourView project is kind of a step in that direction, but it's not by any means there yet. In Reddit, what gets voted up and down fundamentally is links to other sites, and that's great. I love Reddit. I'm a Reddit addict, as many people I know are. But what they're not doing is voting on issues. Should we have more large dams in Australia? Right? Should we have a carbon price? These sorts of questions aren't debated on Reddit, except perhaps incidentally in the comment streams. But there's no rational resolution of those debates. People can argue all they like, but there's no way of saying where do we collectively stand. And so what YourView does is say, well, we can have it. We'll nominate the issue. We can have a debate about it, and we've got a mechanism for coming up with a collective view. And that makes it quite distinct as compared with any other online forum that we know of. One of the ambitions of YourView is to allow anybody to have a say on any issue. So that's part of the problem in our democracy at the moment, is that there's no practical way for somebody, if you feel strongly about an issue, and everybody feels strongly about at least one issue, right, for you to go and lodge your point of view in some way that gets some kind of due recognition. And so YourView is intended to be, it's not there yet, but it's intended to be a platform where any Australian, any time, can register where they stand. So to answer your question, what would make it appealing for somebody to actually engage with YourView? Well, part of the answer is that it offers a chance to scratch an itch. To say, if you feel strongly about coal seam gas, if you believe that farmers ought to have the right to refuse coal seam gas mining on their properties, then you ought to be able to register that view somewhere. And what we're finding is that people do come to the site and they feel so strongly about an issue they just want to be able to express their view, sometimes under anonymity, and we believe that's important to allow that. And so that's one motivation. But then we have to think beyond that, of course, to what would encourage people to have sort of sustained engagement. And we've got various ideas about that. Obviously, some degree of gamification is going to be, obviously we don't describe this as a game, but there are certainly things to be learnt from gamification. We have, for example, a reputation, a credibility score. And we know at least some participants are motivated by this idea that they could develop a credibility score, a high credibility, a high reputation. In fact, that notion of the credibility score is crucial to the way we calculate collective wisdom, so that the more credible you are on the site, the more influence you have on the collective wisdom. But look, I think this problem is one of the biggest challenges for YourView, and it is going to be a long-term project to get it to the point where it is engaging for a sufficiently large and diverse enough section of Australian society that you can point to it and say, well, look, this is really a representative of Australians at large. The flip side of gamification is gaming, right? People who game the system, and we have seen certainly people trying to do that, and so we're engaged in a kind of a cat and mouse game of we introduce mechanisms to counteract gaming, and people come up with other clever ideas, and we're not certain that we've recognised all the ways that people try to game the system, but we're fairly confident we've got most of the obvious ways. And our goal is not to eliminate any possibility of gaming. Our goal is simply to make it so cumbersome or so laborious to game the system that you may as well earn points the honest way. And so far I'd say that it actually works fine in that regard. As we go forward with this Fairfax collaboration for the election, and we get much higher levels of participation, then we expect to face some new challenges with gaming. I distinguish gaming and stacking. So stacking is where you try to influence a result simply by getting lots of people on your own side, right, to participate. Stacking for us is less of a problem because of the way our credibility mechanisms work. People who stack on don't necessarily have credibility. It takes a lot of effort to build that credibility, and people who just pile on generally aren't uninterested in doing that. So stacking, we don't think is a serious threat, but gaming, where dedicated individuals or perhaps bots that they might write actually sort of illegitimately influence the results is a sort of more interesting challenge. So look, it will never be a solved problem. It's something that you just have to continually work on, just like Google constantly has to work on improving its algorithms to counteract the kind of gaming that search engine optimization people are constantly trying to bring off. This whole question of when do groups think more effectively than individuals is complex. There are no easy answers here. I tend to focus on certain kinds of questions. One of my favourite examples is a question like, do we need more big dams in Australia? Some people think yes, some people think no, and there's a range of arguments come into play. How would we know what the answer to that question is? If we take a sort of a kind of a realist view here and assume that there is something that you might call the answer, right, or the most wise response to that question, how would we get there? How would we tell? I think for that kind of a question, the only path is through large-scale inclusive deliberation, high-quality deliberation, structured deliberation. So that's an example of the kind of question I think that can and should be tackled through deliberative mechanisms designed to generate collective wisdom. But again, to use one of my favourite examples, you wouldn't use that approach for the facts of climate change. I think that'd be kind of disastrous. The wisdom of the crowd just doesn't apply to the facts of climate. there you need the wisdom of a special crowd. And so there is a difference between scientific questions and matters of broad public policy. And so, yeah, the premise of your question, I think, is quite right, is that there are many different types of questions you might ask, and very often it is the case that collective wisdom generated in the right way and of the right kind of crowd or group or collective is going to be superior to, for example, the best experts in the field, but it's not always going to be the case. And so especially when there's critical private knowledge, right? When I say private, I mean knowledge that's only held by very few people and for some reason isn't or can't be shared. I would say that in that sense, the facts in some area of science is subject to private knowledge in the sense that there are certain kinds of knowledge that really only climate scientists have access to, and it can't really be shared beyond a certain point. And that's one of the fundamental problems with climate denialists is that they're out of their epistemological depth, and they don't realise it. There's a case of the Dunning-Kruger effect, where if you're incompetent, it's very hard to realise your incompetence. So they don't realise that they actually don't have the essentially the knowledge and cognitive skills required to actually to be entitled to an opinion in the area of the facts of climate change. And so I think the fundamental problem there again is epistemological. The only rational response in this area is the only properly rational response for anybody who's not sort of part of climate science is say, well, I accept what the scientists believe. Unless, of course, you want to go in for bizarre conspiracy theories that somehow climate scientists are all working together to defraud the public. That's truly an act of intellectual desperation. Yeah, look, I'm a believer in hive minds. I am, in fact, a beekeeper in my spare time. So I have beehives, and I subscribe to the superorganism view, the idea that the hive itself, the colony of bees, is actually an organism. In just the same way as our brains are made up of neurons that function together, so bee colonies are made up of bees that function together. And they exhibit all the characteristic, signs of a living organism. So, in the same way, I think of hive minds as collective minds made up of individual minds working together in some way. Now, most hive minds, in this sense, are much more transitory, even than a bee colony is. They're more, they sort of coalesce briefly to come up with certain, ideas, viewpoints. And then they often disband just as quickly. So they're more, generally speaking, more transitory phenomena. But of course, in order to, just as in the human brain, in order for the neurons to work together to support minds, not to be minds, but to support the minds, they have to communicate. So there's all this very fast communication that's happening inside the head. Well, it's also true that the speed of communication, the quantity and speed of communication between humans is greatly increasing, and partly through, of course, Douglas Engelbart's efforts. And so that creates the possibility of having more and more, emergent hive minds or collective minds. That's happening all around us. We don't often recognise it for what it is, but that is, I believe, the case. And I don't have any clear ideas of the future being anything 5 years hence or further, but I can't imagine that in broad terms that this wouldn't continue and will find ever more effective. When your Google Glass has the ability to actually read your the electrical signals from your brain and communicate to me what you're thinking about something, even unbeknownst to the fact, that unbeknownst to you that that's what's happening, will have something that starts to approximate sort of direct communication from head to head, not going through standard speech or the traditional sorts of communication channels. And this will gradually emerge. I'm not sure I like the whole scenario, but this is these sorts of things are surely in our future, unless of course the world has a catastrophic collapse before too long, which is another serious possibility.